No, I don't know. Did somebody got it? And I just want to make sure that we can't hear ourselves on the other screen. Yeah, we're muted. Okay, perfect. Okay, all right, guys. So welcome everyone to the Irish American Heritage Museum. We had been doing these talks monthly during the War of Independence. We were kind of marking the decade of centenaries here ourselves, and then as we came into the Civil War era, we were doing them a little bit less frequently. So we're delighted, and I was giving a lot of them, so I'm sure you're all delighted for a break from me. And I'm thrilled, I have to say, to have Owen O Shea, who's from Milltown in County Kerry, a little bit south of myself. I'm Listowel in North Kerry, but I have cousins down around there, so we're delighted to have him. And he is also a graduate of UCD, where I went myself, and he is currently studying under Professor Dermot Ferreter. He's writing his PhD thesis on political culture and communication in Kerry in the decade after the Civil War. So Owen has been a historian and author for several years, looking at different historical elements of particularly Kerry history. And unfortunately, we were just talking before we came on, the violence during the Civil War in Kerry was the worst and the most prolonged than anywhere else in Ireland. And so for generations, this fratricide, the murder and executions on both sides, the widespread trauma have been synonymous in Kerry with the worst excesses of the mayhem which followed the split after the Anglo-Irish Treaty in 1921. And actually, when I wrote it into my diary to say it, today was the day they were given the ultimatum, terrible and immediate warfare. And I think there was a Galvin man was executed by the Free State today, I think, too. So we're celebrating or marking a lot of anniversaries today. So I'm delighted to have you with us. Thank you very much for agreeing to do this. I know it's bedtime at home in Ireland, so you're very good to stay up late. So I'm going to minimize myself. Everyone that's live, you can use the chat or the Q&A features to ask a question. I'll moderate them at the end. We'll probably let the questions go to the end, just so that Owen's talk isn't interrupted. And the same thing on YouTube, just type in a comment. So I'll spotlight you, and you can share your screen then, Owen. And thank you again.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Just let me set up this here for a second. There we go. You can see that and you can hear me okay? Yeah, great. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and hello from County Kerry, where it's about 11 p.m, but delighted to be with you this evening. I'd like to say sincere thank you to the Irish American Heritage Museum and to your director, Elizabeth Stack, for inviting me to speak to you this evening. I know that you've been running a series of talks for many years on various aspects of Irish history, so I hope that I can complement that this evening by talking about the Civil War in my home county of Kerry. There's so much I could talk about in the time that I have, but I've chosen just a few topics and themes to give you an overview, I suppose, and to offer a flavour of my own research on the conflict in Kerry, and to deal with some of the detail in my new book on the Civil War in Kerry, which has just been published. Much of what follows is based on new material that has come into the public domain in recent years and which is now readily available in archive sources as well as online. So I hope that it will cast some new light on some of the incidents and individuals who are so important to the story of the Civil War in Kerry. And I should add that I don't propose to talk about the wider Civil War or its origins, but rather focus on what happened in County Kerry and to set that in the wider contexts of the period. So by way of introduction, there is practically no disagreement that the Civil War in Kerry was more brutal, barbaric, divisive and protracted than perhaps any other county. And I hope to deal with some of the reasons for that in a moment. Some of those reasons are well known, some of them perhaps less so. The Treaty of December 1921, which coincidentally was signed 101 years ago tomorrow, on the 6th of December. And the war which subsequently divided the country is summed up best perhaps in a comment from Dan Mulvihill from Castlemaine, a man who lived not too far from where I was born, and who was jailed for most of the Civil War. There was, he said, no middle path during the war in Kerry. You were either on one side or the other. The divisions over the treaty in Kerry reflected the wider divisions across the country, and during the early months of 1922, the IRA, Sinn Féin, civil society and society generally divided between those supporting the new Free State and those who believed that the long-cherished Republic had not been achieved. I would divide the conflict in Kerry broadly into three phases. I don't propose to offer a blow-by-blow account of the war, given the time constraints, but I would suggest that the war in Kerry, in what I might call military terms, can be divided into these three distinctive periods. June to September 22, October to February 23, the winter months, if you like, and finally March to May 1923, when the Civil War came to an end. The first engagement of the Civil War in Kerry came just 2 days after the assault on the forecourts in Dublin began, when there was fighting in Listowel, Elizabeth's hometown. The fighting in Listowel claimed the life of the first victim of the war in Kerry, Private Edward Sheehy, who was from the town. The joint statement issued by the commanders of both the Free State and the anti-treaty factions in the aftermath of the fighting, in which they appealed for peace and unity, suggested that whole-scale civil war could still be averted. So in the aftermath of the fighting, both sides came together and issued a joint statement. And in that they said, "We differed conscientiously since the signing of the treaty as to whether the treaty should be worked or the Republic upheld. Unfortunately, the dreaded spectre of civil war is now in our midst. Developments in the last few days have all the more emphasized the necessity for unity. We hope that this will be a headline for every other county in Ireland." And that was signed by Humphrey Murphy, who was the commander of the anti-treaty IRA, and Thomas Kennelly, who was the Free State commander in Listowel. So even in the immediate aftermath of that first incident of the Civil War, there were signs that, perhaps all was not yet lost. But alas, it was not to be, and in the days after the fall of Listowel, 2 Republicans to the anti-treaty side. Many of the anti-treaty IRA in Kerry went to Limerick to defend what became known as a mythical defence line between Limerick and Waterford, and that bordered what became known as the Munster Republic. Both sides became entrenched in their views and in their actions. So to the first phase of the conflict in Kerry, it was the arrival of almost 1,000 Free State forces in seaborne landings at Feenet and Tarbert at the beginning of August, which triggered the conflict in earnest in the county. The landings included members of the Dublin Guard of the Free State Army under Paddy O'Daly, who I'll talk about later, and the 1st Western Division of the Free State Army under Michael Hogan. The episode is very well documented in a book called A Kerry Landing by Corporal Niall Harrington of the Free State Army. The speed and ease with which the Free State Army captured Tralee, Listowel and many of the other major urban centres was extraordinary. Tralee, the largest town in the county, had been captured within hours of the arrival of the Lady Wicklow ship at Feenet on the 2nd of August, and Listowel was taken by the Free State Army very soon after. There were relatively few casualties despite intense fighting in a number of areas around and in Tralee. Excuse me. The army didn't have it all its own way, however, and Republicans gained the strategically important town of Kenmare, which they held until December, and would put up a strong fight, but ultimately a failed one, to retain Killorglin. The so-called Battle for Killorglin at the end of September 1922, which resulted in significant destruction of property and disruption to civilians, has been described as the last significant large-scale engagement between the Free State forces and the IRA in Kerry, at least in a large urban environment. This period of the war in its early months was also characterized by ambushes and attacks on the army, particularly in rural areas, as well as extrajudicial killings of prisoners, including, for example, the brutal murder of 17-year-old Bertie Murphy on the steps of the Great Southern Hotel in Killarney at the end of September at the hands of Colonel David Nelligan. There was also the murder, for example, on Inishfallen Island near Killarney of 2 off-duty medical orderlies of the Free State Army who were aged just 18 and 20, which shocked the county. Such incidents highlighted the very young age at which so many combatants tragically died. Indeed, looking at images of many of the combatants in this period, you realize how remarkably young so many of them were. What can only be described as teenagers died in significant numbers. While the Free State Army was in full control of the county's towns by the end of September 1922, with the notable exception of Kenmare, they had little or no control in rural areas, particularly in South Kerry on the Iveragh Peninsula. The IRA retreated to the hills and valleys and proved a very elusive enemy. And evidence for this is provided in the army reports of the time. There are references here, for example, to, quote, the happy hunting grounds for the IRA in rural Kerry. And one report noted that, quote, this country is so difficult and extensive that it affords excellent cover and easy retreat for the irregulars. The irregulars being the anti-treaty IRA, that name being given to them by the Free State. So over the winter months, we see a standoff almost between the Free State Army in their urban barracks and the IRA in their remote rural hideouts, with a series of individual ambushes, attacks and killings in primarily rural locations and with varying degrees of casualty. The course of the war in Kerry changed considerably in January 1923, with the promotion of Paddy O'Daly, here on the right, to the top army job in the county. W.R.E. Murphy, seen there on the right, circled, standing beside Fionn Lynch, was replaced as Major General of the Kerry Command at the beginning of January. O'Daly, a former member of Michael Collins' squad during the War of Independence, as has been well documented, approached the war in Kerry with determination, vigour and ruthlessness. IRA prisoners in Tralee jail spoke of the screams and shouting that resonated from his office across the yard at the army barracks at Ballymullen in Tralee during his tenure. He was known for being particularly brutal towards prisoners. And in my research on Paddy O'Daly for my book, which has just been published, I tried to be fair in endeavouring to find any redeeming features, if he had any, and I have so far failed to find any. Along with senior officers like David Nelligan and Ned Breslin, pictured here, O'Daly and the Dublin Guard of the Army were, as has been claimed by historian Garrod O'Tuig, they were the crack core element comprised of the Dublin Active Service Unit and of Collins' Hit Squad. You could not get a more determined, a more ruthless group sent in to confront the anti-treatyites in Kerry, end quote. Their actions in Kerry prompted one IRA member to comment that by comparison, the Black and Tans were only a rumour. The management of prisons and the treatment of anti-treaty IRA prisoners in particular is one area in which the approach of the Free State Army to the conflict in Kerry is very apparent. The conditions in prisons, such as those in the basement of the Great Southern Hotel in Killarney and Ballymullen Barracks in Tralee, were particularly harsh. Not only are the accounts of male prisoners replete with accusations of appalling brutality and torture, so too are the accounts of women who were jailed. In Mountjoy Prison, Tig Brosnan from Castle Gregory was on the receiving end of what was called a terrible crucifixion at the hands of a Free State officer identified as Bob Halpin. And Johnny O'Connor of Farmers Bridge near Tralee witnessed how Halpin, quote, struck Tig Brosnan as he was being slung along trying to keep his head up so that it would not be bumped off the floor. Halpin hit him an unmerciful scalp on the head, and the blood burst up like a fountain so that Tig Brosnan was soon a mixture of blood and water, end quote. Sheila Nagel of Ballygamboon near Castlemaine, pictured here, was dragged down an iron stairway in Kilmainham Prison. Dr. Shanahan of Farran 4 reported in 1937, 15 years later, that on her release from jail, she was suffering from suppurating glands in the groin and, as far as I remember, some sort of womb trouble, end quote. The soldiers who forced a member of Cumann Lizzie O'Donnell and her fellow prisoners onto a boat in Tralee Bay on a cold night at the beginning of 1923 were drunk. O'Donnell, as many officers were at the time, O'Donnell and the other women were in terror of our lives or being drowned. The prisoners were taken to Feenit and kept there on a boat for 2 days and nights without any proper sleeping quarters. They spent a week in Tralee jail, which was, she said, just dreadful. The place was simply filthy and the food very bad, and we were allowed no visitors, O'Donnell recalled. Excuse me. March 1923, the events of which I hope will be familiar to some people listening. has been dubbed the Terror Month in Kerry. And I don't propose to go through the details of these tragic incidents because of time constraints. That's probably another talk in itself. But suffice to say that what started as a dispute between neighbours in rural Knocknagoshel in northeast Kerry in the spring of 1923 set in train a series of cataclysmic events which have been synonymous with the worst of the violence and bloodshed of the war in Kerry. Within a few days of the deaths of 5 Free State soldiers in the trip mine explosion at Knocknagoshel on the 6th of March, 17 Republican prisoners were murdered in premeditated explosions in which Free State soldiers planted explosives in barricades blocking public roads. The deaths of the 17 anti-treaty Republicans at Ballyseedy near Tralee, Countess Bridge in Killarney, and at Bahawks near Cahersaveen did more to cement the view in the public mind that elements in the Free State Army in Kerry were out of control and had abandoned any pretense of observing the principles of warfare. Moreover, the events of March contributed to the very strong showing electorally of Republican candidates in Kerry in the election of August 23, just 5 months later, and in the years which followed. To this day, Ballyseedy, Countess Bridge, Knocknagoshel and Bahawks remain the exemplars of some of the worst excesses of brutality and bitterness in the county during this period of fratricide. It would be wrong to conclude, however, that Paddy O'Daly and his men operated in a vacuum or without sanction from on high. W.T. Cosgrave, who was the president of the Executive Council, for example, was speaking the language of extermination at this time. The Free State, he said, would not hesitate in pursuing its opponents and, if necessary, would, quote, have to exterminate 10,000 Republicans if it was to survive. In a message to the Kerry command of the army in February 23, Cosgrave stated that he appreciated, quote, most heartily the very honourable action of army officers in the county. It was perhaps no wonder that O'Daly famously remarked that nobody had asked him to take my kid gloves to Kerry, and I didn't take them. There was one final epic struggle, as it has been called, when a week after the anti-treaty IRA Chief of Staff, Liam Lynch, had been killed and the war appeared to be coming to an end, that a group of IRA members were besieged in a remote rural cave on a cliff face at Clashmelkin, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean on the North Kerry coast. In the dramatic days which followed, 2 Free State soldiers died, 2 IRA men drowned, another fell as the rope which he was climbing was cut, and another 3 Republicans, including Ned Graney, pictured here, were executed at Tralee Jail. Clashmelkin, which has perhaps been overshadowed by the other incidents I mentioned a moment ago, had all the ingredients of the most appalling features of what the war had become in the county. 2 days after these executions, the Civil War finally came to an end. Beyond the specifics of the incidents themselves, what did more to inflame anti-Free State sentiment and buttress Republican support in Kerry was the cover-ups which followed, cover-ups which went right to the top of government. I don't propose to detail each of the cover-ups which followed the events of March 1923 here, but the approach of the government to the incidents that I mentioned at Ballyseedy and Countess Bridge and so on can be categorised as insisting that Republicans were removing the mines when they exploded, dismissing the Republican version of events, defending the actions of soldiers in Kerry, and the holding of inquiries which were nothing more than a sham. The inquiry into events at Ballyseedy, Countess Bridge and Bahawks was a complete whitewash, presided over by senior figures in the army, including Paddy O'Daly. It was held in Tralee on the 7th of April 1923, and it was purported to be an even-handed evaluation of events, but of course it was anything but. The extent of these cover-ups were often only revealed in later years. It was 2008, for example, before the government files in relation to the killing of prisoners at Bahawks were released by the National Archives in Dublin. Those files also reveal how the families of those who were killed at Bahawks were denied compensation on the basis that those who died were alleged to have been involved in planting the mines. The Minister for Defence, Richard Mulcahy, here on the right, would continue to express full confidence in Paddy O'Daly and the army regime in Kerry. Much of the narrative of the Civil War in Kerry omits what I would call the forgotten war, namely the enormous toll on civilians and on the relatives of the combatants involved. My research on the impact of the conflict on ordinary civilian life in the county highlights the enormous and widespread effects of the war on economic, commercial, community and social activity, something I would argue which has not been fully appreciated or documented heretofore. The level of intimidation, robbery, looting, kidnapping, as well as extensive disruption to transport and communications is revealed in significant part in the compensation files, which are held in the National Archives. The files hold just over 1,200 applications for compensation from individuals and business owners in Kerry who were at the mercy of general brigandage, crime and lawlessness in this period. The vast majority of incidents are connected to those on the Republican side. An anti-treaty IRA, which was increasingly unable militarily to undermine the army presence in the county, engaged in other methods which discommoded and impacted civilians as much as it did their enemies in the Free State Army. The theft of vehicles, foodstuffs, clothing, animals, as well as attacks on supporters of the government and their property was widespread, and there are hundreds and hundreds of examples in the archives. In my home village of Milltown, just to cite one example, which is there on the screen, shopkeeper James Murphy, a known supporter of Cumann Niall, the governing party, was kidnapped and held by the IRA for 5 weeks, and his shop was looted. So overt or suspected allegiance to the Free State regime brought with it the danger of assault and attack. This phenomenon was coupled with IRA attacks on railway services, the removal of rail lines, the seizure of mail, attacks on post offices and postal staff, the theft of motor cars, the cutting of roads, the destruction of bridges, the seizure of food supplies, and countless other means of disrupting ordinary life in Kerry at this time. In some cases, this resulted in the loss of life. The most shocking consequence of tampering with railway lines came in January 1923, when anti-treaty forces sought to derail a trainload of Free State Army troops bound for Tralee, and which resulted in 2 fatalities among those working aboard the train. After that dreadful incident, the Freeman's Journal newspaper reported or stated that the callousness with which the wrecking of the train in this case was planned is revolting beyond description, and Major General Paddy O'Daly used the opportunity to remind people what his men were up against, adding that the 2 men who died were endeavouring to feed the people of Tralee, and they had been murdered. So while the actions of the Free State Army in Kerry, particularly in the spring of 1923, which I spoke about, provoked the anger and revulsion of the people of the county, so too did much of the widespread campaign of disruption led by the anti-treaty forces at this time. The other forgotten aspect of the war, now no longer forgotten thanks to the availability of records held in the military archives in Dublin, is the enormous physical and psychological toll on survivors and their families, as well as the relatives of those who died. The pension applications, which are held in the military archives, betrayed the truly shocking impact on those who sought support from the new state, as they endured poverty and hardship, as well as ill health and other traumas. There were extensive mental health problems among combatants in the IRA and Cumann, as well as in the Free State Army, with what is often referred to in the accounts as neurasthenia, an old medical term which is no longer used, but what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. I could devote an entire paper to this subject, but to cite just a few short examples, including that of Tadhg Coffey, the sole survivor of the tragedy at Countess Bridge. 10 years after he escaped that explosion, Coffey was in New York, where he was examined by a doctor who reported, and I quote, "frequent attacks of dizziness, aftermaths of beatings received when prisoner of Free State troops and mine explosion in County Kerry. Unable to stand on ladders or any heights without marked tremors, scar on chin and displaced teeth, history of dizziness, headaches and tremors of frequent occurrence, symptoms of neurasthenia." Coffey's was just one of the shocking examples of the personal ramifications of the war. Women who had been involved in combat or witnessed what had occurred suffered particularly badly too. In a case which the Minister for Defence described as exceptional, Siobhan or Johanna Cleary from Ballymore near Dingle in West Kerry suffered a horrific breakdown and death as a direct result of her involvement in the Civil War. Siobhan Cleary worked as a nurse at Cork Mental Hospital and was an active member of Cumann in the city between 1920 and 23. She was arrested in 1923 and spent 14 days on hunger strike. Despite a very traumatic experience in prison, she returned to her work as a nurse, but became very unwell in the summer of 1924. Cleary was admitted to the infirmary of the hospital where she worked. She died on the 9th of November from exophthalmic goiter and exhaustion from, quote, incessant vomiting for 7 days. Dr. Cashman, who cared for her, was in no doubt as to why she had died so suddenly. Shock, strain, hardship of imprisonment, and hunger strike during the period of civil stress. The case of Free State Army Private Joseph O'Brien, who lost both his legs in the explosion at Knocknagoshel, is particularly tragic and details as a vivid example the physical and mental torture endured by so many for so many years. O'Brien's widow had to repeatedly beg the government, his wife, I beg your pardon, had to repeatedly beg the government for a wheelchair and a commode for her husband, and spent years writing to officials appealing for help. In August 1925, Annie O'Brien asked for an invalid chair as it was the only way she would be able to take Joseph out for air each day. He also required a tricycle and a harness to get around, and as he became increasingly blind, appealed on a number of occasions to be readmitted to hospital for treatment. For years after, there was a need for a tricycle, stump socks, shoulder straps, replacement prostheses, and other medical supports, which were provided with departmental assistance. It's just one example of the suffering endured by combatants and their families, which are contained in the military archives and which, thankfully, now are online and available to be researched, and which really reveal the depth of suffering and hardship in the decades after the Civil War. Poverty was endemic among survivors and their families, not just among Republicans, but also among those on the Free State side. In just one example, Michael O'Connell of the Castle Island IRA wrote in his application for a pension that, quote, "We are near starving. I cannot afford to pay a workman in my stead on my little farm." In other examples, the mother of Private Michael Rock, who had rendered service during the Great War, according to his file, and was shot through the heart near Cahersiveen, was left in, quote, "very great poverty after he died." "When I came home from prison after the Civil War," wrote Billy Mullins from Tralee, "I came back to poverty." These are just some of the devastating accounts of the trauma endured by those caught up in the war, which betray the real extent of the impact of those who survived and were left behind, and which now can be, thankfully, thanks to the Military Service Pensions Collection and its availability online, can be fully ventilated and appreciated. Just to briefly reference the casualties in Kerry, for those interested in that data, there were at least 86 Free State Army deaths, if combat and accidents are included, while 73 Republicans died, 42 of them in extrajudicial killings, according to research I've done and that of others like Tom Doyle and Orson McMahon. The war claims the lives of 14 civilians, 1/3 of whom died in my home village of Milltown. One of those was killed as he talked to his neighbour on the roadside when a passing Free State Army soldier decided to fire shots indiscriminately from his vehicle. So, why was the war in Kerry so bitter, divisive, and protracted? These are some of the main reasons, and this list is by no means exhaustive. The remote and rural terrain of Kerry, if anyone online is familiar with the county, you'll know that it's the terrain is remote and not very navigable unless you know where you're going. This facilitated a guerrilla-style conflict, with the IRA having the upper hand in the countryside and the army in control of the towns. So this was a key factor in prolonging the conflict. Secondly, the divisions within the IRA, which predated the Civil War, were also a factor. During the War of Independence, IRA headquarters believed mistakenly, it must be said, that the Kerry brigades were inefficient and lazy, and the tensions with Dublin, which were created in that period as a result of that attitude, endured thereafter. Moreover, the presence of so many outsiders among the army in Kerry from August 1922, particularly the Dublin Guard and the 1st Westerns, cemented the sense of those not native to the county imposing their might and will on a county on the periphery and far removed from the capital city. I've already mentioned the dreadful treatment of prisoners, which no doubt contributed to the bitternesses and the tit-for-tat conflict. The behaviour of so many in the senior ranks of the army, as well as the cover-up of some of the most appalling incidents, certainly left a very long, divisive and enduring legacy. And as I've argued, perhaps less known or less appreciated was the very widespread campaign of disruption and criminality indulged in by anti-treatyites who were hell-bent on making Kerry effectively unpoliceable in their efforts to place Kerry beyond the control of the Free State Army. And finally, the toll of the war on civilians, combatants, and on the families of combatants was profound and long-lasting. In particular, what is most saddening and moving is the extent of nervous breakdown, admissions to psychiatric hospitals, suicide, and other horrors, usually suffered in private and in silence, which ensured that what occurred and what followed almost universally went unspoken. And certainly that was the case for generations. It's perhaps no accident then that for so many years the Civil War was not mentioned in Kerry, either in political or public discourse. These things, according to Donal O'Donoghue, a Fianna Fáil TD and anti-treaty IRA member, were, quote, rather gruesome to talk of. The veil of silence remained in place for generations, but I hope now that as we embark on and continue through the centenary of these traumatic events, it will allow an engagement and re-engagement with what happened and why. If I could, before I finish, mention a forthcoming conference that I'm involved in organising with others, which will mark the centenary of the Civil War in Kerry and which will take place in Tralee in February. And it's part of the government's Decade of Centenaries programme, supported by the government department, and it'll feature a wide range of academics and speakers on the war in Kerry and beyond. And full details of the programme will be published on our website in the next week or two, if anyone is interested in finding out more. As you may know, my new book on the Civil War in Kerry has just been published by Marion Press, and which I believe is now available through the museum. And finally, if you'd like to find out more about the Civil War in Kerry, my website and social media contact details are there. And if you'd like to get in touch, please do. So I look forward to any comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Owen. That was fantastic. That picture that you're using for the conference is Listowel. It is indeed, yes. Free State Army arriving in Listowel in 1922. Yeah. St. John's. That's right. And I should say too, there's a bullet hole in my grandmother's fireplace in the sitting room from, I believe, from that Free State and IRA exchange. Our store is right on William Street, and yes, bullets were flying. So indeed, I'll kick off questions, but those of you who are online, if you want to write into the Q&A or the chat, and I'll read out your question, and the same for the people on YouTube. We'd be happy, or Owen will be happy to take your questions. But sure. I mean, I have written down a whole page of notes. I should say too, Owen, when I was teaching at home in Listowel years and years ago, I went to a conference, and there was a man who at the time was 101. I believe he was from Castle Island. Mm-hmm. He was an anti-treaty guy, and he spoke about Ballyseedy and, kind of the legacy. He talked about actually two families in Tralee never spoke again, that if one guy was in the pub and the other fellow walked out, the original guy would go out the back. So, I mean, you're right. I think that the kind of vitriol never died in Kerry, even though we didn't maybe speak about it. And so, did you think it was strange that the Free State soldiers seemed to adapt a lot of the black and tan, like this idea of just driving by a street and wildly firing your weapon? That happens so often during the black and tan years that it's kind of incredible that they were using it themselves, Well, I suppose what you must remember is that the Free State Army, which was a new army established following the foundation of the state, was under enormous pressure to bring the war to an end. And Kerry was one of the counties in which the fighting continued after the Civil War had ended in much of the rest of the country.
And there was pressure internationally coming from the British government, as well as from the government in Dublin, on Paddy O'Daly and his peers in Kerry to, if you like, finish off the anti-treatyites and bring the war to an end. So inevitably that led to a greater degree of frustration and, if you like, hostility within the Free State Army towards those who were continuing the war on the anti-treaty side. So to some extent it was inevitable, even if it wasn't justifiable, that they would descend to, you know, and I quoted one IRA man there who said that the Black and Tans were only a rumour in comparison to some of those in the Free State Army. So I don't think you, as I said in the presentation, you can't view what the army did in Kerry in this period, the Free State Army that is, you can't view that in a vacuum. There was huge political pressure from Cosgrave and others in government to, you know, why in the name of God is this war still going on in Kerry when it has ended in other parts of the country? Would you not bring this to a head and bring this under control? So I think that certainly added to the pressure cooker that existed. But certainly, whereas many in Kerry would have welcomed perhaps the arrival of the Free State Army in large numbers, civilians that is, in the autumn or winter of 22, by the end of the Civil War, certainly the Free State Army had a very, very different reputation, not least because of the way they extrajudicially killed Republican prisoners in significant numbers in the spring of 23. So I hope that answers your original question.
This is just fascinating. You know, Michael Barrett is asking, do you have an idea of the political split between sides prior to the treaty? Was Kerry as staunchly IRA as I have been led to believe? Now, I'm not sure, Michael, if you mean IRA pre the split or post the split. But you can answer it both ways, I suppose, Owen, if you like.
Yeah, no, it would be incorrect to say that. I mean, outwardly, at least, the three Kerry brigades of the IRA were in the majority, at least, were anti-treaty. But if you drill down into the data, but in terms of IRA companies and branches of Sinn Féin around the county, there were significant numbers of members of both the IRA and Sinn Féin who supported the treaty. And it wouldn't be fair to portray Kerry as being maybe as universally anti-treaty or as universally Republican as maybe has been portrayed. Certainly in the period between the signing of the treaty and the summer of 22, you see significant ruptures happening, you know, and IRA companies are dividing, Sinn Féin branches are dividing, other organizations are dividing too over the treaty, and within IRA companies in particular, friends and neighbours are falling out with each other and taking different sides. Quite a number of, whereas I spoke about the Free State Army officers who came into the county from Dublin and other parts of the country, quite a significant number of men in Kerry signed up and joined the Free State Army. It was, you know, it was an attractive job, but it was a paying job at a time when there was little or no employment. So they did that for financial and family reasons as much as political reasons. But so as I say, whereas certainly the majority within the IRA and Sinn Féin were strongly opposed to the treaty, politically the county divided in two. Of the 6 Kerry TDs or members of Parliament, 3 voted for the treaty and 3 voted against. So they split right down the middle in terms of political representation. But to say that Kerry was you know, pro-treaty or anti-treaty universally wouldn't be a correct characterization of the actual divisions over the treaty.
Well, and it's interesting, I suppose we had kind of big names politically. You have Pierce Beasley and Austin Stack and Benon, you mentioned him there, who were all quoted in the treaty debates, like at length on either side, you know, so it was interesting, yeah. Yeah,
and what you must remember is these people like Fionnán Lynch and Austin Stack had fought together side by side, and, you know, in the War of Independence, in some cases back as far as the Easter Rising in 1916, and now they were you know, facing into the prospect of taking up arms against each other. And, you know, there were notable efforts politically and so forth to try and prevent civil war, but there was an inevitability to some extent about that drift towards the outbreak of the war in June 22. And as I say, those who had fought side by side, even Stephen Fuller, who I didn't mention in the piece, but who was the sole survivor of the Ballyseedy explosion, who later became a TD within his own company of the IRA in Kilflyn. There were some who supported the treaty and some who went against. So you have friends and neighbours in communities falling out with each other very bitterly over the treaty. And that's, I suppose, what infused the conflict in Kerry with such hatred and bitterness for so long.
And Owen, I mean, this might be kind of an impossible question. Do we know how ideological was that split? Like, I think there's so much going on after the War of Independence, like, and some historians say partition was hardly kind of mentioned, and, the North is there since 1912, and it was something, I suppose we all thought the Boundary Commission would be something that would clear that up, so that wasn't a pressing, matter. Is it an ideological split, genuinely, like about the oath or about, the compromise, or is it a sort of a PTSD type thing, like we fought for this, and or I killed people for this, as is depicted in that movie, The Wind That Shakes the Barley, that when you've compromised your own ideals so much to not get exactly what you claimed you were fighting for, was that hard to let go for some of them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a combination of all of those things. Certainly ideology, there were people like Austin Stack and others who believed that the treaty was an absolute betrayal, that it didn't go far enough, that, having fought in the War of Independence, they believed that, what was it for this, that we lost so many of our comrades in the war against the Crown forces and the Black and Tans. Others, of course, on the other side, who believed that the British government were never going to concede a republic on their doorstep, so to speak, at the time that the British Empire was, still a significant international force, and those who recognised, to use the oft-quoted Michael Collins phrase, that it was a stepping stone to further freedoms. And I suppose that's why. That's again why everything became so incredibly bitter, because, as I say, these people who knew each other very well and who had fought a common enemy were now disagreeing so vehemently over the treaty. As well as that, I suppose there were other forces at play, including, for example, the Catholic Church, which, particularly within the hierarchy of the church, was very pro-treaty and supported Cumann and Niall. There were a few very strongly vocal anti-treaty priests in Kerry, but the majority were pro-treaty. Other organisations in wider civil society also took various positions. So yes, there were certainly ideological reasons for all of that, and there was a sense perhaps that at the end of the War of Independence that the prospect of a republic was still there, but when Stack and others in Kerry learned of what had been signed in London in December 1921, they were absolutely disgusted, and to some extent the die was cast, and within 6 months, unfortunately, the country was engaged in a civil war.
That kind of annoys me, I have to say, sometimes. Like, Stack didn't go to London, am I right, the first time in June? And so he more than anyone must have known. Like, De Valera went and couldn't get any better. In fact, they got more out of the British government the second time they went. So that kind of annoys me. Like,
yeah, Stack went to London for the initial discussions with Lloyd George in about July 21. Yes, and I'd say had a fair sense of the way things were going, but certainly, I'd say even at that point, he, and Stack was incredibly loyal to De Valera up to that point, and had in the Dáil, he said he would commit suicide the moment him and De Valera would let us down or let the country down. And Stack, even when Fianna Fáil was formed by De Valera in 1926, when most anti-treaty TDs and former Sinn Féin deputies who opposed the treaty joined Fianna Fáil, Stack remained outside and remained a Sinn Féin TD until 27 in Kerry, and died at a young age in 1929. So he probably personifies more than anybody else the anti-treaty sentiment in the county at the time.
And particularly, I think, from the ideological,
Absolutely. Yeah, very much so.
I wanted to ask you too, just to clarify for some of our members who mightn't understand, will you talk to us a little bit about like the whole pension thing? Were the Free States, not the Free State, were they anti-treaty guys who had fought, obviously, you know, for Ireland in the original War of Independence, were they entitled to claim for a pension? Did they get them? How does that all work?
Yeah, not initially. In the period after the Civil War, the Free State government, the Cumann government, initially made pension payments available to those on the Free State side only. So former Free State Army officers, many of whom were demobilised because the Free State Army had become swollen, I suppose, far too many members. So it wasn't until De Valera came to power in 1932 that he introduced legislation to provide for pension payments for those on the anti-treaty side. So it was only then in the early 1930s that anti-treaty IRA members and those in Cumann who had opposed the treaty became eligible for pension applications. And in most cases, the pensions that they were eligible for were very small. And in the vast majority of cases, applicants were turned down because there was a very tedious and laborious process in which an applicant had to prove their military record from the period 1916 through to 23, had to get references from their IRA commanders at the time and various other sorts of documentation to satisfy the eligibility criteria. But so in most cases they were turned down, and as I referenced, in some cases, you know, the families of combatants and those who survived and those who the relatives of those who were killed endured dreadful hardship and poverty for generations, and not just those on the anti-treaty side, but as I say, those who had been in the Free State Army and on the Free State side as well. So whereas the state did make some reasonable efforts to compensate those who had suffered injury and loss, it certainly never went anywhere near what was necessary, I suppose, to fully address that problem, and that is one of the great dreadful and traumatic legacies of the Civil War.
Yeah. So I think that soldier that you're talking about, that, you know, they're still looking for wheelchair years and years later, he was a Free State soldier, Joseph O'Brien.
He was, yeah, correct, yeah.
Now, with these IRA guys, were they part of the group that were kind of reinterned again in the 30s, you know, during the emergency, as it's called? Like, how peaceful is their life after this? You know, you've fought this Civil War, and we all go on about our business in these small towns in Kerry, like, or were they constantly kind of monitored?
No, in most cases, I mean, life went on. I mean, what's remarkable in Kerry and in Ireland in general is that in the period after the Civil War, you know, with a few exceptions in the 30s and in later decades, that I suppose the peace prevailed. You know, it was only 4 months after the Civil War that a general election was held, and for the most part, that election campaign passed off without any violent incidents. Those who had fought in the anti-treaty IRA, many of them emigrated. Immigration is one of the huge features of the period after the Civil War. Those who remained behind got on with life for the most part. A few of them became again active or remained active in the IRA into later decades, but the majority of them didn't. Many of the anti-treaty IRA leaders entered politics, men like Tom McAllister, Stephen Fuller, Johnny O'Connor. You know, they went on to forge political careers for themselves. And I think that remains one of the extraordinary legacies of the Civil War, a positive legacy, I suppose, if we could call it that, is that for the most part, in the decades thereafter, well, at least certainly until the outbreak of violence in the north in the late 60s, that, you know, peaceful conditions prevailed, and people just supported the democratic process and accepted the democratic mandate as expressed in general elections for so long after that. And you know, I think for the most part that's something that we can be thankful for. You know, that that's a Civil War, if you like, didn't. You know, with the exception of a short period where the Blue Shirts and other organisations were in conflict with each other in the mid-1930s, for the most part, that you know, peace and order prevailed.
Absolutely, yeah. Michael responded to your answer. He said, "Thank you, very enjoyable talk. Although you did dispel his great Aunt Mary's long-told tale of the great and heroic IRA stronghold of Kerry." So that's unfortunate. And then Andrew asks, how did the upper class English landlords fare in the aftermath of the treaty, both north and south? Were there any pro-Republican? And I mean, this is where it gets very complicated, actually, because there are, and Kerry, we have issues with the big houses in Kerry at the time.
Yes, you do. But from my own research, and I think other research, there isn't any strong evidence, at least, of a particular sectarian approach, if you like. Certainly big houses and those of the landed gentry or the British aristocracy in the county or in the country were targets for arson and for looting. Primarily, I think, in many cases, to prevent the Free State Army from getting their hands on them as barracks. And certainly there was a sectarian underbelly to many attacks, and there were several houses, big houses as they're known in Kerry, that were burned and attacked. But there certainly, in my opinion, isn't enough evidence to suggest that the anti-treaty IRA engaged in a whole-scale, full-blown series or campaign of attacks on the Protestant community or on, if you like, the landed gentry of the time. So, whereas many of them were subject to attacks and arson in some cases, and some fine buildings and houses were lost in that period. It would be wrong to suggest that that there was deliberate targeting on a large scale across the board.
Okay. I think someone is raising their hand, but it might just be to say hello to us, or do they want to ask a question? So you can unmute yourself if you need to ask a question. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk to you, and we talked about it just before we went online, was with the women's issues. I thought it was fascinating when you were talking about the psychological effects and all of that. But it must have been, it kind of must have been worse for women that maybe couldn't report a rape or discuss that this had happened to them. So I was wondering if is your research kind of bearing that out, like that? I think we tend to have a myth, that our own crowd weren't as bad as the Black and Tans, and so this didn't happen, but we're finding out now more and more women's heads were shaved. There was certainly gendered violence, and so maybe in a society where you couldn't admit that you had been raped for whatever reason, must have been very difficult.
Yeah, I think if you read the accounts in the military pension applications, which, as I say, are available online, in which women outline what they endured in this period, in many cases, as other historians and academics have suggested, you can read between the lines and infer or at least conclude that there was a sexual element to many assaults on women in the period, and certainly a lot of the accounts of the Cumann women in Kerry in this period referred to assaults by Free State Army soldiers, and it's quite apparent that even though it's not explicitly stated that women were sexually assaulted, and in perhaps one of the better known cases or infamous cases, perhaps known as the Ken Mayer case, there were two daughters of a medical doctor who were dragged from their home by Paddy O'Daly and two other Free State soldiers. This is a few weeks after the end of the Civil War, and were brutally beaten in outside their home. And there are other similar cases and examples. And I think, as well as that, what unfortunately the duty of many members of Cumann and many of the women in this dreadful period is that they had the unfortunate task of going to the scene of ambushes or attacks or explosions to, if I could be as blunt to say, pick up the pieces of the bodies that were strewn all over the road. And at Ballyseedy and other locations, there are women who talk about having to go to these locations to gather up body parts. And that must have had and did have an enormous psychological impact. And certainly accounts from the period indicate that many women had nervous breakdown and suffered huge mental health problems in subsequent years as a result. So certainly, and it's only in recent years, I think, really, that we're coming to appreciate or understand the extent of the physical and psychological scars that many women were left with in this period. And that's because it's typical of Irish society for so many decades and generations to suppress and, dare I say it, ignore the stories of women and treat them as second-class citizens for many. In the case of the military pensions applications, they weren't recognised as legitimate combatants at all, even though many of them risked their lives and were involved in activities that were as dangerous as those in which the men were involved. So, but yes, you're right to raise it as an important feature of the conflict.
Mm-hmm. And then my last question, and if anybody else has one, they can ask too. But I want to ask you: do you know if, even though we talked about the Protestants, we'll call them, that maybe stayed or left, did many of the IRA guys leave the county? So Coffey, for instance, you mentioned, came to New York. Yeah. Was there this idea like that we shouldn't stay at home, there's kind of nothing for us, so we'll leave?
Well, there was a little bit of that, but there was also, generally speaking, economically, the country was in dire straits throughout the 20s and the 30s, and immigration was the only course for many, as people in your part of the world will know. So if you read the accounts, and you can see on some of the pension application files, you can see the addresses that people give, and in many cases the addresses given by IRA men are in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and certainly the research by others, not just me, in locally in recent years, has shown the extent of immigration, not just among men, but also among women who, for financial reasons, had to leave the country, but also, I think, to some extent for ideological reasons, those who felt they had fought for so long to try and achieve a republic in Ireland, and who still felt, even after the Civil War, dreadfully betrayed or disappointed with how the country they fought to achieve, or the republic they fought to achieve, hadn't materialized. Felt compelled to leave, and certainly because of the prevailing economic situation, and because of rampant unemployment and huge difficulties in trying to make a living, immigration was often unfortunately the only choice.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and I'm thinking, about ones that came and said they were involved and maybe they weren't, and it gave rise to a whole kind of new kind of mythology, I suppose, about, because it was very easy to claim you were involved if you weren't, or to pretend you weren't if you were, and you needed to be on the run, kind of a thing. Yeah. So, Owen, this is absolutely fabulous. As you remarked, we do in fact have the book in stock. So those of you who are in Albany or, New York, we can ship it to you. It's better to buy, of course, from your local shop than to buy online, but you can get it online too, I'm sure. And we're delighted to have had you on. Thank you very much. I think it's a fascinating study. And, the more we see of these local kind of studies, the more nuance it's giving to the story, actually, because you can get down into the details. And I will remind people too that those military pension files are online. They're absolutely fascinating. So you can kind of, if you have no particular name to search, just root in through them. But if you are looking for a particular name, you might find it, because a lot of them are, searchable and digitized and things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, thank you very much, and best of luck with the rest of the dissertation. This book is fabulous, so I'm sure you'll have no problem finishing it up. I want to remind everyone we're back on tomorrow with our commemoration of Black 47. We're talking to Dr. Una Walsh, and she's going to give a lecture about the epigenetics and the legacy of trauma, how that affected Irish people after the Great Hunger. And then on Thursday, we're in person with our Child's Christmas in Wales. And then Sunday, we have the Brendan Fahey Beckett documentary series. We're showing Project Children, or How to Defuse a Bomb, Project Children, and we'll have the filmmaker up here to answer questions and answers, and a little reception. So that's at 2:00 on Sunday, but live only. In person, we can't show the film online. So thank you very much. I'm so sorry for keeping you up late. You're past the witching hour now, but we appreciate it. And
thanks to you, Elizabeth, and everyone for joining. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Okay, take care. Enjoy Kerry.
Take care.
Bye-bye.